Thank you all for being here. I don't think there's any subject in ancient history that's more seductive than Egyptian art. It's also been the subject of masses of sci-fi rip-offs and crazy-looking gods that are green and blue and gigantic. I wanted to persuade Henry to put some of them in, but he's a serious person, so you have to just imagine it. So today we get to hear about Egypt, which is everybody's favorite. No, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people love it. And I'm very happy to introduce Henry C. Matthews, you left out your middle initial, to speak about ancient Egypt. Thank you, Henry.
Oh, so I have to, I do it here, yes. No. Yes. I don't think any image could better proclaim the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife. Tutankhamun, a young king who died early, lives forever thanks to enormous precautions taken by his people. He was encased in gold, embalmed, encased in gold, and put in a tomb with everything that he would need for the afterlife. And he's still with us. He's still with us. If there's one Egyptian everybody knows, I think it's him. I'm going to focus on several issues. First of all, as I mentioned, the preoccupation of the Egyptians with the afterlife and the extraordinary beginning of architecture, of buildings made of cut stone. The world's first known architect, Imhotep, building the first massive Egyptian tomb that survives. Imhotep discovered architectural principles which have been used ever since by architects, and I will mention some of them as we go along. The first tombs were low structures divided into many compartments. I'll show you one soon. The compartments contained everything that they would need for the afterlife, but that was impractical, and so they shifted to the idea of the pyramid, which in a sense was an abstraction for the afterlife. So simple, so beautiful, and how could anyone not believe that the pharaoh would live forever if he had a pyramid? I think I will. So let's just talk very briefly about the Egyptian gods. The sun god Ra has the body of a man, as many gods did, but in this case the head of a falcon, and then above his head is this image of the sun, and a woman is worshipping him as he sits on his throne. Osiris, god of the earth. I was putting in lots of gods, but I had some technical difficulties this morning, so we'll just have these two, but you will realize that they have tremendous presence. The first tombs were called mastabas, which is simply an Egyptian word for table. These were found standing in the desert or half buried in sand, and they were rectangular, divided into many compartments inside. On the exterior, we see a series of vertical ribs, if you like, or buttresses, and these probably represented or were similar to the bundles of reeds that were used for earlier houses and palaces. The burial is in a shaft in the middle, not very deep. You can see it in the section here. This was the shaft. There it is in section, easier to see. And there are these many compartments. But was it practical to take everything with you that you needed for the afterlife? I think of people leaving their homes as fire strikes in Altadena and thinking, what do we take with us? The Egyptians had a little more time and they took a bigger range of precious things. I'm not going to go through the history in much detail. The funerary complex of the pharaoh Djoser, built in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, was an extraordinary change from the simple mastaba tomb. It was surrounded by a huge wall, almost a mile long, and that wall was brought to life by the many projections and recessions. You can see the surface of the wall is not flat. And how do we get in? There is only one entrance in this position here, which leads into a hall of columns. So this is the first stone building of cut stone ever constructed, and the first with columns. That effect of light and shade is similar to that used at the ziggurat of Ur in Sumerian architecture, which we saw last week. Big projections and recessions, but they're much more exaggerated here. Let's look at what this complex contains. First of all, there's just one entrance here going into a hall of columns. The first stone columns ever made. And then we enter a series of courtyards. This huge courtyard here is called the Hebsed Court. The Hebsed was a festival for the pharaoh after from every 20 years he was supposed to run a ritual race with himself to show how incredibly vigorous he was. I'm always a little confused. If I was running a race at the age of 60 and then I had to wait 20 years for the next chance to show that I'm still up to something, that's rather a long time, but that's the way they did it. Every 20 years he did it to eternity. So this is the entrance hall. And then in this courtyard, there are a series of chapels. Interestingly, they are only exteriors. They have no interior space. But as we'll see, the exteriors are impressive. Then we come to Egypt was divided into two areas, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. They were separated earlier, but in the first dynasty, the first king, Nama, brought the two kingdoms, the two areas together. But Djoser needed government buildings so that he could govern southern India, Egypt, and northern Egypt. Then at the entrance, at the base of the pyramid, is an element called the Sedab, where a statue of King Djoser sits on a throne and looks out through a small hole. We will see that. And from there, there's an entrance that goes deep into the space under the tomb. So here is the entrance. And note that the columns are very similar to Greek columns, but they have ribs running up them rather than grooves. And these ribs seem to me to represent, to imitate the bundles of reeds that were put together for the very first houses. These are actually from Mesopotamia. I showed you this before last week, but dwellings in Egypt was very similar, made of bundles of reeds, and that surface effect is reproduced in the outer wall. And going through the hall of columns, we come to a place where we get a view of the pyramid. This was the first pyramid ever. It was not intended to be a pyramid, but the king went on living, and so they got better and better ideas. Then here on the left is the south tomb. Why two tombs, I'm not sure, just to be sure. And along the top of the wall are cobras' heads, which are obviously symbolic. We come into the courtyard with the chapels or shrines to the gods, which, as I said, are only facades with no interior space. But as you walk through this courtyard, you can imagine looking at this row of chapels and imagining something very magnificent inside. Some of these have been reconstructed. Reconstruction of ruins is a controversial subject. Some archaeologists think that it's absolutely dreadful to try and show what was there originally, but I find that it's very helpful. We'll see the palace at Knossos in Crete, which has been partly reconstructed, so it makes it easier for people who come there to visualize it. There are the lower walls of one of the government buildings, the North Building, and a diagram on the right shows how it imitates the early buildings made with bundles of reeds. And there are some very interesting columns on the north building which represent the papyrus. On the right you can see papyrus reeds growing in the water, and in this picture it's possible to make out the flower head of the reed, which has given the shape to the capitals of the columns. In the history of architecture, ever after this, architects have taken symbols from nature, rather less in the modern era, but even then, symbols from nature which bring the architecture to life. On the north building is one column still standing, which looks very like a Greek Doric column. If you thought that the Greeks had invented the Doric column, you're out by a few thousand years. So this is an incredibly impressive piece of architecture. We know the name of the architect, Imhotep, who later became raised to the status of a god. Not surprising. It's a thing that other architects have tried to do and still attempt, but they don't quite make it in the same way. Now, let's look at a section through the pyramid. First of all, it was built as a rather large mastaba, exactly like the ones of previous generations, though the shaft to the tomb was much deeper and much more intriguing as well. Then they built a small step pyramid over the mastaba, and Djoser said, "This is good, I want more," and so he got more. The tremendous height of it, and it's quite interesting to look at the way that there's a sort of central area that is cone-shaped, and then these various blocks, buttresses of stone sort of lean against it, so that the weight is concentrated inwards, making it less likely to fall or get damaged. And the same idea follows in the first pyramids. At the bottom of the shaft are walls decorated with lapis lazuli. As far as I know, that was only found in Afghanistan, and how they got it to Egypt, I have no idea. Maybe there was some lapis lazuli somewhere else. And the walls have a texture that could be said to imitate reed mats that made the walls of early buildings. And there, against the back wall of this compartment, is King Djoser himself running the ritual race for the Hebsed festival, which he'll do every 20 years or 40 years, I forget which, to eternity. He's still at it, I'm sure. And in the Sedab, a little enclosure at the foot of the pyramid, the statue of Djoser sits on a throne, and he looks out through a small opening. There he is, gazing out from the Sedab, as he still does. Well, this was very complicated. Could every pharaoh compete with Djoser in something like this? They definitely competed in size, but not in complication. A few pharaohs later came the solution, the pyramid, a completely abstract symbol of the afterlife. This is, instead of providing all the material things that the pharaoh needed, we have a symbol of his kingship and his transformation to a god. These were the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, the pharaoh Khufu, his son Khafre, and his grandson Menkaure are on the left. The grandson is on the left, slightly smaller. And these have survived all these years to astonish us. How many of you have seen the pyramids? I regret that I have not. The pyramids were connected to the Nile River by a long causeway, which was walled in and covered with a roof. At the river end of that causeway was a mortuary. Beneath each pyramid was a mortuary temple, and then at the edge of the Nile, the valley temple. And these themselves took enormous quantities of stone, as did the pyramids. And it could be said that the angle of the pyramid represents the rays of the sun. I wish that I could have been in a boat on the Nile, looking at the sun coming through the clouds and seeing the rays coming down parallel to the sides of the pyramid. And the interior is incredibly scientifically thought through. In the center is a great cone of stone, or actually it's rectangular rather than round. And then leaning against it are buttress walls. And because they're leaning against a sloping surface, any kind of earthquake would shake the stone inwards rather than outwards because of that lean. And then it's covered with straight, the gaps between the tops of the buttresses are filled in, and the whole surface is covered with smooth stone. This section through the pyramid shows an entrance high on the wall of the pyramid, not easy to reach, and if you were a grave robber, you would have to climb up the wall of the pyramid and remove stones weighing several tons before you could enter. Interestingly, then there's a sloping passage and then a rising passage, and it's probable that this was intended to be the burial chamber, but they became more ambitious and created an enormous passage leading up to the tomb. And the tomb chamber is a almost cubic space with a vast stone covering it. But just in case the weight of the pyramid above would crack that stone, they put another there, and another, and another, and another, and finally two sloping stones to absolutely ensure that nothing could collapse on the body, the tomb of the pharaoh. There were also some air shafts that came in. This is an air shaft. And there is the passage leading up to the tomb. Again, they wanted to be sure that nothing collapsed down on it. So the stones above gradually move further and further in until they have it narrow enough that a stone lintel can cover it safely. And amazingly, there were portcullises. I think they used the word from the medieval castle for a sliding gate that came down to close off the castle, and these were supported from huge rollers, and there was not just one but three, so the passage was protected by these portcullises that nobody could penetrate. This is the unused chamber. Perhaps that was intended to be the tomb chamber, but they decided to make it higher. In front of one of the pyramids is the Sphinx, believed to represent Khafre, the son of Khufu, the pharaoh in the largest of the pyramids. It's the Sphinx has the head of a man and perhaps the body of a lion. The valley temple of Khafre's pyramid, the second pyramid, is an extraordinary space, and in it is a statue of Khafre himself, sitting square with his shoulders level, his hands on his knees, his traditional pharaoh's headdress. And notice at the back of his head is a falcon. See the feathers of its wings. What an incredible symbol. While so much in Egyptian architecture is ornamented. This space gains its impact by being utterly simple. Now, less is more is a slogan of Mies van der Rohe, a modern architect whose architecture was extremely simple, and that was intended to be its strength. And certainly the interior of this valley temple with the pure rectangular columns, no surface ornament, is very impressive. I'm going to jump now several generations. We have the Old Kingdom with several dynasties of pharaohs, and now we come to the New Kingdom and the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut. She was the only female pharaoh. She must have had extraordinary strength of character to overcome that male chauvinism shown by the ancient Egyptians. But there she is with a completely new idea. Her chancellor, whose name was Senmut, is thought to have originated this incredible idea. It is thought that Senmut and Hatshepsut were lovers. I have no proof, but I'll go for that theory. Against a cliff, a craggy cliff, a series of horizontal levels with regular openings, simplicity of form against the irregularity of the cliffs. One of the greatest architectural statements ever made. Queen Hatshepsut, her temple was approached by a great central ramp, and before that was a row of sphinxes. We go up from one level to the next. And then we reach at the second, at each level there is a hall of columns. These interior spaces must have been incredibly impressive. Why doesn't this? No. Yes? Ah. Oh, Mentuhotep is later. In the plan, you can see that Hatshepsut started a new approach, and Mentuhotep built his tomb here. Why can't we get to the next slide? This. Who doesn't want to go? Okay, I'll try to keep it down here. Oh. You have the touch. Okay, I'm going to keep it in that position. So here we are at the next level. And again, the architecture is absolutely simple. These pure plain surfaces of the columns, which will be lost in future temples. Very impressive. And then we come to the upper courtyard, and in this case, the columns are faceted, not fluted like Greek columns, but with a series of facets. And at the upper level are a couple of, on either side, symmetrically placed, a couple of chapels. This one is the chapel of Anubis, the god, and on the wall you can see the god. I think this is the god Anubis with that hat, tall hat of two elements. Yes. Pharaoh after pharaoh built tombs and temples along the Nile, and excuse me. And the diagram on the right here shows a ceremonial route which led from one temple to another. And very often the bodies of pharaohs were carried up these passages and went into one temple and another. But this is, I'll go next to the small temple there is the temple of Khons, and it follows a pattern that we will see in temple after temple. At the entrance is a vast wall slightly leaning, a massive wall leaning back slightly, and this is the equivalent in another temple. You can see the idea of this massive wall, and then you enter into a courtyard lined with columns. Imagine a pharaoh being carried on a throne into this space. He's in the bright light of the desert. He enters through the central portal, comes into the courtyard and looks towards the columns that surrounded it with shade at the back, and then moves further into a smaller and darker space. And then here was a place where the throne could be set down, or in the case of a funeral, the body of the pharaoh could be set down, and then the inner space smaller still. And that progression we will find in many others. This is the temple of Luxor, further up the Nile, approached by an avenue of sphinxes. Maybe avenues are supposed to be trees, but this one is sphinxes. And then In front of the entrance is an obelisk. There's another Egyptian invention. I grew up in London where we had Cleopatra's Needle, a small obelisk standing by the Thames. The British were not the first to steal obelisks. The Romans brought several back to Rome. There's one in the middle of the Piazza del Popolo, which was a great urban space in imperial Rome. So the combination of the pylon, this wall slightly leaning, massive, and the obelisk vertical is very impressive. Or two statues of pharaohs could stand in front, could sit enthroned in front of the entrance to the temple. The great temple of Amun at Karnak, Amun being one of the gods, follows a similar pattern to a larger scale. We approach up the avenue of sphinxes, enter through the pylon into a courtyard, and then into a hall of columns. Now, the first hall of columns was at Djoser's funerary complex. But this one is on a much larger scale. Imagine walking into this space and looking at the central axis between the rows of columns, but when you look to either side, you are in a space that seems almost endlessly filled with columns. Move on to a second interior pylon, a second hall of columns on a smaller stage, on a smaller scale, and then on and to the final point. And then there's another approach from one side with pylon after pylon. The Egyptians were very traditional. They liked to follow previously taken roads. Many temples are designed in this way, with obelisks contrasting with pylons and halls of columns. Here is a section through one of those inner areas, and if you look at the detail, it's fascinating how light is brought in up here through stone screens. I'm sure that the gradual dimming of the light was symbolic of the purpose of the temple. From the bright light of the desert, you go into gradually dimming light. So there outside the row of sphinxes, inside the row of columns, and these columns have capitals very similar to one that I pointed out in Djoser's compound. You remember the papyrus imitating column. of course, the light would not have come in down where we see it now. Only the dim light through screens like this. And the surfaces of the columns were ornamented with low relief carving, which told the stories of the heroic lives of the pharaohs. You can see similar low reliefs on these columns here at Karnak. In the temple of Ramses II, there's an amazing statue of Ramses. As you look here, you can imagine from his feet how vast he was. And here is his wife between his shins, Nefertari, in all her magnificence. Higher up the Nile is the incredible temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. This one is actually carved out of a cliff, not built up of stones. If you go through the entrance, you come into this interior space with statues of the pharaoh standing against columns. I think I'll go back here. This temple was threatened by inundation by the River Nile after it had been dammed. And this temple was actually cut up into blocks and moved. But those pharaohs with their stylized beards still stand there impassive. So, Egyptian architecture was a highly symbolic architecture. The pyramid, with its pure geometric shape, the sequence of spaces from the pylon through the courtyards to the inner sanctum were repeated again and again in countless buildings, but with incredible effect. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
With all the precautions they took to keep the tombs sealed, how did thieves get into them and steal the actual pharaoh's body? Well, it's not there. They say it's not there.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. I think there was a long period when people weren't so interested in the pyramids. There they were alone in the desert, and groups of thieves would climb up the outside of a pyramid, hack away at the stones and make their way in. Many failed, but all three pyramids were plundered, and so were many, many other tombs. And one type of tomb that I didn't show were the underground tombs, which were simply below ground, with a shaft leading down to them that was completely sealed, but still, like the tomb of King Tutankhamun, I should have included one of those. Yes.
Well, Henry, these spaces that are so impressive, and how were they? What I imagine is that after they finished all this building and the effort, and the workers went away to work on the tomb for the next pharaoh, how were the spaces used at all? Do they have like once a year processions, or it's a little disturbing?
Egyptians loved processions. Egyptians really enjoyed processions, carrying images of gods or pharaohs, parading through. I'm sure there was music. Oh, I wish we could have a demonstration of one of those processions going through the temple of Karnak, or one of the others, with music playing and great crowds waiting outside. Only the important people would enter the pyramid, enter the temple, I'm sure, but great crowds would have roared their applause as these events went on. Yes, Sam.
Sam?
There is a wonderful book called Empress of the Nile that describes the effort to save these antiquities from flooding after the construction of the second Aswan Dam and the massive lake that it would produce and flood all those. And the heroine of the story is a French woman, Christiane de Roche Noble-Court, who had to fight her way all her life into the male-dominated world of archaeology, but she was successful. And you showed the picture, Henry, of Abu Simbel, and it took 2 years for the engineers to figure out how they were going to raise that temple 200 feet so it wouldn't be flooded. And it was an amazing story. There were 2 final engineering firms that bid on it. And the firm that got the work was Italian. And they were so worried about damaging the temple when they were cutting the sandstone into blocks that the only people they figured who could do it right without damaging the antiquities were the marble carvers out of northern Italy.
Carrara.
Yes, and they brought those people down, and the way Lynn Olson is the author of this book, Empress of the Nile, and the way she describes it, it's excruciating because they're working in temperatures of 120 and 130 degrees, and persisting. And because of the threat of the rising waters, which had started to rise, they went to shifts, 2 12-hour shifts working 7 days a week. And they managed to do it without any damage to that temple, Abu Simbel. And I recommend it to anybody who likes this story because it is such a fascinating tale. And there's a lot more to it than I just described. It's called Empress of the Nile. It's written by Lynn Olson, who is a very distinguished British author, and she's written many bestsellers. And this is another one of her bestsellers. It's terrific.
Is it in the library?
I have no idea.
Well, we'll try to find it. Did you want to comment on your feeling, because you said you'd been to the pyramids, and how did you feel when you went to the pyramids? I'm just curious.
Well, what I had hoped was to get more of that feeling, but there were so many visitors. You just felt like you were kind of plowing your way through all the people, and that was a disappointment to me. But at the same time, it's just fascinating, just to be in the presence of those things. Yeah.
To me, they look overwhelming and claustrophobic. Anybody? Okay, we got lots of people back here.
I have, well, two questions. How did those stones stay together? How were they put together? The other is, this is just overwhelming, considering when it was constructed and designed and calculated. This was, I mean, eternities ago. How come that technology didn't really move north to the degree that it could have been replicated? I mean, whatever happened, whatever construction, whatever aqueducts were created in Europe, it was nothing compared to this.
Well, of course, I don't know the answer to that question, but it is the skill with which the temples were first built was incredible. I remember reading a description of the base of the pyramid. It was constructed on ground that was not completely level. I don't remember the dimensions, but the four sides of equal length meet at four corners, and modern scientists have calculated that maybe there's a few millimeters in error in the height and exact position of the four corners. The skill is amazing. And then, of course, how did they get the stones up? What kept the gravity? They began by building an inward leaning central structure, and then more and more outer layers lean against it. So each stone is just has a base that is sloping very, very slightly. And it worked.
Just a comment on Abu Simbel. It's an extraordinary place as you approach with these amazing statues in the front, but the interior is quite beautiful. But an interesting thing, it was well over 100 degrees when we were there, but as soon as you walk into the temple, the temperature drops at least 20, 30 degrees. Self-air conditioning, I guess you call it. It's a quite comfortable place to stay.
Thank you.
I was just going to comment on the Temple of Karnak, and yet the impression one gets when you walk through this tremendous column of tremendous structures, and it's in a way it's like walking through Northern California with those magnificent trees, and it's so quiet, and I'm so glad you have the picture of the man and how small it is in comparison with those columns, because it was remarkable, just remarkable.
Thank you.
Other comments? Did you have a comment? No, you're just pointing it.
Bob in front.
Another feature that was translated in the north in Greece and Rome was, I noticed the just in this slide, there's this, what do you call it, entasis? The sides of the columns are not straight. They curve slightly inward and tapering to the, which gives more of a feeling of stability. But anyway,
But I've heard people say that the fact that the columns of the Parthenon, for example, have slightly curving sides, though you barely notice it, makes it more like human limbs. You know, if we all had legs that were dead straight on all sides, I don't think we would be quite as sensuous as we appear to be.
I presume that all of these low relief carvings were painted, probably, with really vivid color, right? Don't you think?
I believe so.
Yeah. And I think if we want to get a sense of all this, we should look at some contemporary sci-fi movies where they filled in all the blanks, right? I mean, it's really interesting to see, and they do. I'm sure they have ritual processions and music and everything. If you can enjoy that kind of thing.
Henry, I have a question. In order to carve these stones, what metals were used? Was it iron? Steel hadn't been invented at that time, I don't think.
That's a very good question. And copper, which was the most available metal, is quite soft. Copper. And then there were statues carved out of diorite, which is incredibly hard. It must have taken months and months and months just to carve away a little bit. It's a very good question. I'm sure that the Egyptians wished that they had a better answer. I think they're mostly limestone. And they come from cliffs on either side of the Nile, quite a way back from the river, and to carry those immense stones and lift them up is just astonishing. They would make great ramps of sand and drag them up with hundreds of people pulling on ropes.
Henry, I have a couple of questions, but one of them that first came to me, am I saying this correct, that there's a column that curves and comes up, and then there is a second column, or is that part of the capital that is broader? So it's like a column is.
This one may
that's a good picture of it.
May clarify it a bit.
Amazing. And is there anything that we know or has been written about the surveying of all of these to know how precise they are? What do we know anything about instruments or measurement of all of these incredible, like the curvature, and that they're identical? And is there anything written or known in history about that?
I'm sure people have devoted their lives to questions like that, but
sure.
I haven't read what they wrote.
So in your research, you haven't come across any writing of the methodology for putting these together?
I haven't, no.
Well, that could take just about as long as it took to build them then. Yeah, wow.
Ina?
And do you have a suggestion, or anybody in the audience have a suggestion of where to see well, two things: the whole collection that is along the Nile, and then in addition, the sequence of each of these. I see dates on many, and I've studied this, but not in any depth. And I'm seeing things here that I hadn't even come across in my history of architecture, other than the Cervantes or Fleischer. But do you have any suggestions of resources, or anyone else in the audience?
You followed chronology, didn't you, Henry? You started with the earliest and went to the most recent later.
Well, I've used various books. I may not be up to date. You know, I wouldn't claim to be an Egyptologist, and
We have about 10 books in our apartment.
yeah.
Oh, we forgot to mention the archaeological site. Can I say something?
Yes.
We saw a show at the British Museum, I think it was the British Museum, about the lost cities of the Nile. Oh, we're running out of time. And it was in the Delta, where they started finding deep underwater all sorts of temples and cities and sculptures. Incredible, incredible. Ina, we're running out of time. I think, is this supposed to be an hour? I don't know.
I think so.
I don't see people trying to get in here.
So, quick question: the economics of it. I mean, the laborers obviously were slaves. They didn't get an hourly wage. They must have died in that temperature. I mean, by the hundreds, if not thousands. What happened to the populations of those countries, of those pharaohs? I mean, they
Well,
must
there've
have
been-
decimated the
There've
whole
been
region.
a lot of thoughts about that. Some people think that they were not built by slaves, but by farmers in the off season. You know, the Nile floods every year, and the water inundates the fields, and then it recedes. There are long periods when the farmers have absolutely nothing to do. And so some people think that they were employed in large numbers. They weren't highly paid.
Well, what's interesting about that, Ina, and in this book I referenced, Henry's exactly right. It was seasonal work, and when the waters receded, the farmers could harvest the crops that they tended. When the flooding came back, they became the labor force, and a number of the pharaohs built villages for families, and they lived there, and they were paid, and they were fed, and it was total common sense. In order to do the work, to haul those stones up the ramps that Henry made, they needed people who were healthy and strong. So they understood that to get the construction completed, they had to treat the people well. So in that sense, it was very advanced.
Better than us.
Very, very well explained. Thank you, Sam.
Here we are, another question from Roger.
Well, thank you. There was an article not long ago, and I have to go back and find where that source was. We have an internet. That's fantastic because we can delve into some of these things. But there are recent discoveries that are in the Delta that are the lost city and have incredible stories of what they have found. They found the housing. They have found what those towns, I mean, they were huge towns to accommodate all those people. Maybe you read that too. But, I'm going to go, I have to go back to my computer and do a little research. And where was that?
At the British Museum.
I think it was the underwater cities, was it? Or they lost, I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway, lots of questions.
Fabulous story about them discovering this whole other area. That. Any more questions, comments?
Comments? Bob has.
Bob has another question.
Third turn. Just looking at this, facing the unanswerable question as to whether history goes forward or backward, but someone said that with all the glories and detail and sophistication of this culture, it seemed in decline as it moved north to Greece and Rome and other cultures. Somehow things were less achieved. But my little inner socialist says, well, on the other hand, what they left here in Egypt, how much did it really help the common people? I mean, after it was built. And then I think of, well, Rome and the aqueducts and the so forth, and the plazas which were left, which were forums for more than just the aristocracy. Anyway.
I don't think these things could have been built by miserable, unhappy people who were being subjected to.
But it does go back to Ina's question: is why wasn't it translated into other buildings in other? Well, I think there was a huge decline for quite a few centuries, wasn't there? And then the Egyptians the Greeks came over, wasn't it?
Yeah, Alexander.
Yeah. So they didn't sit and look at these columns and go back to Athens and make something, but yeah. Other comments? No, you don't have a question? Well, it could be also that they didn't have handy cliffs to carve the columns out of. They're so gigantic. So they had, and their columns are marble, aren't they, in Greece and Rome? We'll hear about that.
And also, Northern Europe, or Europe in general, is far more humid. So it would have disintegrated even the rocks.
Okay. Well, we're being left with Nefertari between the feet of Ramses, which is a little bit aggravating. So she's not she's not the one that built the famous temple, right? Nefertiti. No, who was it? Hatshepsut. Right. This is not the Nefertiti that we've heard of, though, is it? Different. It's spelled differently.
Nefertari.
But anyway, that was great. Thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm really glad to have all those excellent comments.
Thank you.